problem with small screens. It's hard to get distracted. All right, so y'all just had a test over interactions, and so that's the main thing that we've got left to cover. So we're going to talk about interactions in context of our radiation output, KVP and mass band. Y'all settle down. We're excited to be here. We talked about on this last Friday is we talked about voltage rectification and what it is that we're going to go through this semester in voltage rectification and how it affects the output of the X-ray tube. So remember, your voltage rectification is going to be the same on any given machine. You're not going to be able to change it, but you do need to know what happens in between rooms of different different X-ray output or different X-ray production, different generator types. So you need to know all that stuff. Even though most likely what you're going to be working with is high frequency, you still have to know it. It's still registry testable and all that stuff. So we talked about the two types of tubes, and they're really defined by their anode motion. And we've got some subcategories that we talked about last semester, like a bibevel tube and things like that. But the basic fundamentals are the same, and that is we have a cathode and an anode with at least one filament. Most machines you're going to work with are going to have two filaments. So you've got a rotating anode, which is what you're going to work with most commonly. I've only ever, outside of a dentist's office, seen one stationary anode X-ray machine, and that was a portable unit that nobody used. It was an antique that just kind of sat, all by itself, and nobody ever touched it because it was outdated. So you're going to be working with rotating anode X-ray tubes. If you go to the dentist's office, they've got these really cool X-ray units now that just look like a little gun they hold up to the side of your head and they shoot you with it rather than that big thing that hangs from the ceiling. So it's really pretty cool, but they don't have a rotating anode. They just beep and you're done. So that's about the only place that you're going to see the stationary anode X-ray tubes in a dentist's office. So we talked about the components of the anode end of the X-ray tube. We talked about the components of the cathode end. So the anode end, we've got the rotor, and that's everything that rotates. And then we've got the stator, and that's the part that's outside of the X-ray tube. That will be your electromagnets on the outside of the tube, but inside of the protective housing. The target is the specific area of bombardment on the disc itself. So the entire disc in some machines might not be tungsten. So what you may have is a disc that's made up of something else, and then just the target area, the focal tract, is made of tungsten. So everything else may be made of something different. And the purpose for that is that those materials are less heat conductive, so it helps to keep the heat off of the bearings. So the heat on the anode does a number of different things. If you apply a high exposure on cold anode to crack it, the bearings, we talked about that. On the cathode end, we had two filaments, one for detail and one for high exposures. That's where all your heat comes from. Source of thermionic emissions, remembering that we always have a filament current going, just to keep the tube warm so that we don't wind up in this situation right here, right? So that's the whole purpose for that, but the purpose for that circuit is to provide thermionic emissions. So at the prep stage, you get the rotation of the anode, you get the creation of the space charge. But in addition to the filaments, we have the focusing cup, and it's also negatively charged to compress that stream of electrons so that they hit the portion of the anode that we want it to hit. So we kind of talked about all that. The target is tungsten and rhenium. The rhenium just adds some strength to the target itself, and it affects the characteristic spectrum. We use the tungsten primarily for heat, but also because it has a relatively high atomic number, plus it conducts heat very well, and so that's what we use it for. We took a look at the different brim spectra for the different target types. So you can't use gold as kind of a silly example, but it shows what would happen to the brim spectrum if we could use gold. It would increase the height of the brim spectrum, and it would push it towards the high energy side. Tungsten, we get a good spectrum. It's not quite as good as what it could be with gold, but it's still pretty good. And then your mammo targets have a totally different distribution spectrum from what we see with tungsten. So again, just more stuff. Anode heel effect. We didn't really touch on the anode heel effect last time, but the anode heel effect can certainly affect our sharpness of recorded detail, and we do have a difference in sharpness between the cathode and anode into the X-ray tube, and we're going to discuss that later in the semester. So we're going to hammer that pretty hard. So that's all the stuff that we're going to talk about this semester on the tube, negative versus positive, what gives us our thermionic emissions, what's responsible for X-ray creation, the interactions that give us the majority of the beam, what parts move and what don't, and we just really talk about all this, but what things are responsible for sharpness of recorded detail. We talked about extrafocal radiation, blooming, how that differs from extrafocal radiation, and we'll talk about how to extend the tube life. We'll also talk about some quality control. We'll introduce that for everything that we use and every component that we use and every setting that we set. We have specific quality control measures that we have to abide by. So a physicist comes in once a year and takes a look at everything. All right, so we talked about gassy tubes and all that. We talked about different types of filtration. Did we get into filtration really much? Just a little bit. Okay, so we did talk a little bit about filtration. Remember, we have two different types of filtration. We have inherent filtration, and different textbooks you might see different definitions of inherent filtration. And just so you know, if there are differing opinions among authors, like the most obvious would be the two big positioning textbooks are Merrill's and Von Traeger's. And if they're at odds with something, which is really pretty rare, but if one teaches something and one teaches something different, they're not going to put the specifics of that thing, maybe the general idea, but the specifics of that thing is not going to be on the registry. Okay? So the reason I point that out is because there are differences of opinion in what constitutes inherent filtration. Okay, so the strictest definition of inherent filtration is only filtration would be the envelope, right? And you got to have an envelope to make X-rays. Yes? Yeah, you got to have the vacuum and all that in order to make X-rays. So in that extreme, the envelope is your only inherent filtration. But you can't expose somebody with just the envelope, right? You have to have 2.5 millimeters of aluminum equivalent. So the envelope, the oil, the port, the back of the mirror, all of that goes into inherent filtration. And for our purposes, we're going to say you can't. Inherent filtration is everything that gets us to 2.5 millimeters of aluminum, so we can legally make an X-ray. If we can't legally make an X-ray on a human being, we're gonna if we remove any of that filtration, we're gonna say that we're out of regulations. We can't make an X-ray. So whatever it takes to get us to 2.5 millimeters of aluminum, that's what we're going to call inherent filtration. So long way to go about that, but that's all inherent filtration. So if the oil, the envelope, the port, and the mirror only gets us to 1.5 millimeters of aluminum, we need 1 more millimeter of aluminum, right? That's still inherent filtration because we have to have it to get to a legal point of making an X-ray on a person. So 2.5 millimeters of aluminum. So that's inherent filtration. Everything else is added. With the one caveat that as the tube ages, then we get an increase in filtration because of tanning. All right, so that is also inherent filtration, but it's inherent filtration that builds up over time. And the reason we're going to make that distinction is because you can't open the tube up and scrape that off. It's always going to be there. You're also not going to go in and shave off parts of the back of your mirror so that you bring that filtration back down. It's increased inherent filtration. Okay. I kind of dissuade you from calling that added inherent filtration because that kind of confuses things. I'd say increased inherent filtration with life of the X-ray. All right, so collimator housing. Collimator is just top to beam restriction. Beam restriction is the main thing that we use after the filtration for radiation protection. If you don't expose the patient in a specific place, they don't get exposed in a specific place, right? So if you use your collimators, and you should, as much as you can without eliminating anatomy that needs to be seen, then if you can, you need to use your collimators. So you have two sets of collimators. The lower collimators are the ones you're most familiar with. I think I talked about this on Friday. The upper set primarily controls your off-focus radiation. The lower set are the shutters that you see. So you're going to have a tendency to say, how many sets? Well, there's two sets. One set comes in this way and one set comes in this way. Well, that's one set of shutters. One total set of shutters, that's your collimators you're most familiar with. When it's talking about two sets, there's another set that you don't see. That's those multi-leaf collimators that I was talking about before that control the off-focus radiation. So tube housing, we talked a little bit about that. It protects against leakage radiation, thermal shock, primarily rough handling also though, and provides mechanical support for the X-ray tube, something to screw the X-ray tube onto it. So filtration's effect on the brim spectrum. If we lower the number of low energy X-ray photons, we use the example that if I threw a test grade out, what would happen to your overall average for the class? It would go up, right, if I threw out your lowest test grade. So kind of the same thing, we're getting rid of the low energy X-ray photons. We do get rid of some X-ray photons that might make it to the image receptor. So our output goes down, output from the housing goes down, patient exposure goes down, image receptor exposure goes down. So what it does is it decreases our numbers and pushes towards a high energy side. Has no effect on the maximum energy characteristic spectrum. Primarily what it does is it eliminates those low energy photons, and by doing that, it pushes towards a high energy side. It gives us a higher average, lower output. Okay? So we talked about X-ray creation. Brims accounts for 85% of the X-ray beam, as opposed to characteristic is the other 15%. With the brims, there's no minimum energy. Really no limit to the maximum. Whatever you set on your control panel, provided your machine is shooting properly, should be your maximum, and it's going to represent all of your energies from effectively 0 kVp all the way up to whatever you have set. So the characteristic, it's the ejection and replacement of electron, and the energy level that you get is the difference between the electron that leaves the shell and the energy level of the X-ray that the electron that replaces it. So it accounts for 15% of the beam. It accounts for 15%, I think, at the anode. My personal opinion, I don't find this in literature anywhere, but my personal opinion is that 15% includes all levels of characteristic X-rays created in the beam. That 85%, I think, is higher once it comes through all the different levels of filtration. I think a vast majority of the beam, I'd say 95% is probably brims once the low energy characteristic get eliminated. So interaction with matter, I think it's actually chapter 10, but that's all right. So this should be very familiar with you since you just took a test over that this morning. Electromagnetic radiation interacts with structures that are similar in size to their frequency and wavelength. They're their wavelength specifically, amplitude wavelength probably more specifically. So what all do we have in the characteristic spectrum? Or I'm sorry, in the electromagnetic spectrum? Microwaves, right. What's that?
Ultraviolet.
Ultraviolet, okay. So we got visible light, ultraviolet, microwaves, we got radio frequency. Some of these things are really long. When I took physics for this program, we actually calculated radio frequency wave off of a station out of Dallas. And the station, the frequency was 102. They used to play classic rock. And we actually calculated the length of that wave, and it's like 27 feet or something like that. So what do you use to pick up radio waves? Television. What do you, well, television, cable, but what do you have on, what's that? And it's an antenna, right. So your antennas have some size to them, right? So those interact with things that'll pick up the signal, right? But what is it that the X-ray interacts with in your body?
Tissue.
Tissue on a cellular level, right? So electrons, you know, little bitty things. So what we've got is a frequency, a wavelength, and an amplitude that's very, very, very small. So it interacts with your tissue types, your DNA, your cells, things like that. So they're very, very small. Very small wavelength, no larger than 10 to the negative 8, 10 to the negative 9 power. So the higher the energy of the X-ray, the shorter the wavelength. Low energy X-rays interact with the entire atom, as opposed to the higher energy interact with the electrons. Now, Amy said she was going to drop a bomb on you all. I think it was Friday. The whole thing about scatter radiation, right? What do we tell you about scatter radiation? You increase KVP and what happens to scatter? What did we tell you before Friday of last week? It increases, right? So can both of those things be right?
No.
Sort of. It's a perceptional thing, okay? So let's do this. Let's do this. Get rid of that one. This is highly, theoretical and very basic. Okay, so to kind of write this out and make it true to life is just beyond the scope of what we need. So let's say we make 2 X-ray beams, and in both of those X-ray beams, our output is 100 photons. Okay? So we have 2 X-ray beams, one at 60 kVp. We make 100 photons. And then we have another one that is 15% higher than that. 15% above 69 would be roughly 70. So we're going to say 70 kVp. It's really 69, but let's say 70 kVp. And you know that if you increase your kVp by 15%, if you want, let's say this is at the image receptor, if you want to maintain the exposure at the image receptor, what do you have to do with mass? You have to cut it in half, right? So in this case, what we did was we increased our kVp to 70 kVp, we lowered our mass, and we still have 100 X-ray photons, okay? Now, you pick the anatomy. It doesn't matter what anatomy you shoot, but let's say in this case, what we have is 30 photons. Well, instead of just right now photons, we'll say 30 interact by PE, which is total absorption, right? 30 are scattered, and 30 penetrate, right? So we got a pretty much an even number here. All right. So as we increase to 70 kVp from 60 kVp, what does kVp control?
Power.
What's that? Power. I heard a couple other answers. penetration. So it controls our penetration. So we have the same number of photons. We're going to have more penetration with this one, right? So we've got 70 kVp. We've got 100 X-ray photons, so we'll work backwards from that. So what we're going to have then is, as kVp goes up, our penetration to our image receptor, we may have, since kVp, if we increase kVp, we would otherwise increase our penetration through the patient if we didn't do anything with our mass. Now we're going to have 60 at the image receptor, so penetration is going to be 60. Okay, so automatically, what are these two going to do?
Go down.
They're going to go down. They're going to go down. Okay. Now, consider that these are not just penetration without interaction, but they're penetration, some without interaction and some with scatter radiation. Okay? So let's divide those in half, and we'll say that 15 are straight penetration and 15 are scattered. Okay? So if we cut this in half and do it the same way, then how many straight penetrate? 30 and 30 scattered. Okay? So in this case, did our overall interaction decrease if we go 20 and 20? Is what Amy told you Friday true? As kVp goes up, interactions decrease? Yeah. Is it also true that as kVp goes up, we get more scatter at the image receptor? The answer is also yes. Okay, both can be true. Yep.
So we're getting scatter from the X-ray beam at first, which is the top numbers, and then also scatter from the ones that penetrate after.
Right. You're always going to, some of the penetrated beam is going to be scatter radiation.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Got
So, and that's where I was kind of going with, we can make this real complicated. We can say, well, they're scatter. We got scatter that are going to be PEs. We got scatter that are going to penetrate.
Okay.
I was trying to keep it simple.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Okay. Can you kind of see how both can be true? So as kVp goes up, we still got to deal with the scatter. That's what we're going to talk about some this semester. We're going to talk about grid use, how we are going to use grids to clean up that scatter radiation, how we can use things like lead shields to clean up the scatter. All right, so really, you should have talked about potentially really 6 different interactions. 5, one subcategorized into 2. So what you've got then, primarily the interactions that we're concerned with are the ones we just talked about. We've got penetration, we've got photoelectric absorption, and we've got scatter radiation. But there's really 2 types of scatter radiation. There's Compton scatter, which is what we really are talking about when we're talking about scatter. But there's also classical scattering. Amy mentioned classical. Okay, so classical is almost indistinguishable from straight penetration, except for the energy level. The energy level is going to be very low, but it pretty closely parallels straight penetration. So your grids might or might not pick it up. We're going to talk about virtual grids this semester, and the virtual grids may be more efficient than our traditional grids in picking up our classical scattering. So primarily what we're going to talk about is penetration, photoelectric absorption, and Compton. But the Thomson or classical scattering is also another thing. So wide angle scatter radiation. So coherent scattering, not important in any energy range. Our Compton scattering is what we're going to be looking for, photoelectric absorption, and the rest of that is really therapeutic. So where we have photoelectric absorption, the entire energy that X-ray photon absorbs inside of the patient. Again, it might start off as a scattered photon, right? So it may interact with something, it may bounce around inside of the patient a few times before becoming absorbed photoelectrically inside of the patient. In addition to that, if you expose the patient, you knock out a orbital electron from one of their cells, one of the atoms inside of the patient can become an X-ray emitter. So what you may have is more scatter created inside of the patient and most likely absorbed inside of the patient unless it's way down deep just before it exits the patient. But you may create more scatter radiation inside of the patient and have more radiation because you expose the patient. So just the photoelectric absorption doesn't just mean that you have a single impact and a single interaction inside of the patient. You may have scatter radiation bounces around inside of the patient. And then, so it's Compton, and then it becomes photoelectrically absorbed. Okay? So when we're talking about the transmission, primarily what we're talking about is the transmitted without interaction plus the scatter radiation. I think that's really it. Everything past this, I loaded this into Canvas. I described the different types of interactions, and then it just kind of got down here where towards the end of it, it just went on and on and on. And so I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at your packet or not, but I got to this point and it's just like the rest of it's just beating a dead horse. It's in your packet so that you can look it over if you really want to, but we just covered and you just tested over the interaction types. So I'm not going to begrudge the point, but those are the interactions that we're going to focus on. Your dose is going to come from Compton, okay? Your dose should never come from the primary beam. It should come out of the patient. The patient is the X-ray emitter that is going to expose you, okay? So in that context, the way that you're going to protect yourself are the ways we talked about before: time, distance, shielding, right? And use multiple layers of shielding, but we'll get into all that this semester. Any questions? I know that's awfully short, but
so with our test, do we need to kind of understand the brims with like the 69 kVp and stuff like that?
yeah, the 69 kVp is going to be pretty specific in your questioning for the characteristic spectrum.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm probably not going to ask you a question pertaining to the brim spectrum at 69 kVp. If you see 69 kVp, just automatically think characteristic. I mean, we're going to have brims at 69 too, but
Right.
Generally the questions.
So with our brim spectrum, are you just talking about like filtration, average, number of photons, stuff like that?
Yeah, the height being the number, average being the peak of the bubble, maximum and minimum energy levels, maximum kVp, minimum being filtration.
Okay.
So, and I think I found, let me take a look at this, just make sure I'm not lying to you. I think I found, I'm just going through files. Come on. Okay, so I invented all that just to try to make it look like subcategories, It's a little bit of a mess, but I can load this into Canvas so that you can have it as well.
Is it the same test?
Pardon?
Is it the same test?
Should be. I made this in 2017, and let's see. X-ray production, KVP. I'm not, okay, I hadn't looked at this in a while. So, well, obviously I looked at it in 2023, so it should be pretty up to date. I'm not gonna swear on my life. All right? I can see where it's going. But it should be a good study tool. So I'll put it in Canvas. This one's actually got the answers to it. So that one, give me that one. That's one. Okay, I'll put it in Canvas. I'll do it before I leave the room, otherwise I won't forget about it. All right, any questions? Yep, we're done.
I actually do have a question.
You got a tall hill climb, don't you? All right, which?
I'll give you my notes after. Just the ones due this morning.
Oh, the reason it's dropped. Want to do those.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
There was a way, I looked at it.
I'm about to go back there.
So are you keeping all the leaves?
No, I don't know where.
You too.